The air in Westminster Abbey was cold enough to bite, the kind that seeped into stone and bone alike. Autumn light filtered through stained glass, splintering into shards of crimson and gold across the flagstones. From your place near the altar, you clutched your prayer book tighter, watching the ripple of movement as servants hurried along the aisles. Whispers darted between the pews. This was to be no ordinary royal wedding. She had come from France, they said, a princess, the daughter of King Charles himself. You had blessed unions before, between nobles of influence, lords and ladies whose names carried weight, but nothing that had stirred the court like this. When the great oak doors opened, the procession entered, and you felt your breath catch. Richard II of England, in his 29th year, strode forward in full regalia. His height and golden hair caught the filtered light, making him almost otherworldly. At his side was a figure so small it seemed a mistake. Surely this could not be the bride? She barely reached his elbow, her thin fingers swallowed in his gloved hand. She was 6, perhaps 7. Her gown was a masterpiece of French embroidery, its skirts so heavy with pearls and gold thread that she swayed under their weight. Her dark hair, braided and looped with pearl string, glistened like a crown in itself. She was beautiful in the way children are, bright-eyed, curious. But here she was, stepping into the role of Queen of England. You steadied yourself against the altar rail. In your lifetime, you had seen girls wed at 12, sometimes 13. But this was childhood still wrapped in the gauze of innocence. And yet, you knew better than to be shocked. Half a century earlier, the plague had scoured England, taking nearly half her people. Life was short. Alliances needed sealing while there was time. Marriages like these were treaties written in flesh and bone. The king's choice was no scandal among those who understood the stakes. It was strategy, a promise between two kingdoms that had bled each other dry for decades. When Richard spoke his vows, his voice was not commanding but gentle, as though speaking to a frightened bird. He bent his head to meet her eyes, his tone protective. This was not the leering appetite of a man seeking a young bride for pleasure. This was politics, calculated and ceremonial. The marriage, it was said, would remain unconsummated. The girl would be raised in England until she came of age, learning the ways of the realm she would one day serve. You murmured the blessings over them, your voice steady, though your pulse quickened with unease. The child queen's gaze swept the vaulted arches and flickering candlelight with open wonder. Somewhere deep inside, you wondered if she could sense already the weight of the game she had just entered. Her name was Isabella of Valois, and this marriage was no romance. It was a fragile bridge stretched across the carnage of the 100 Years' War. Her small hand in Richard's was meant to carry the hope of peace between England and France, hope enough perhaps to silence cannons for a generation. But peace in this century was a fickle creature. You had seen too many treaties crumble, too many promises drowned in blood. As the vows were sealed, you could not help but think this little queen's life would be lived at the mercy of forces far larger than herself. And so, under the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, history stitched a golden thread between two enemy kingdoms. The thread was fine, almost invisible, but you knew how easily fine things break. Isabella of Valois entered the world on November 9th, 1389, in the heart of Paris, within the grand chambers of the Louvre Palace. Though the Louvre of her day was a fortress of turrets and thick walls, not the museum it would one day become. From birth, her life was marked by contrasts. She was born to extraordinary privilege, yet into a family shadowed by instability and fear. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was a man of two faces. In his lucid moments, he was every inch the monarch commanding in council, a patron of the arts and a figure to inspire loyalty. But in his other state, which came without warning, he became something else entirely. History would name him Charles the Mad, and the name was no cruel exaggeration. The tales whispered through the palace corridors would have sounded like madness themselves to anyone beyond those walls. The king convinced his body was made of glass, refusing to move lest he shatter. The king, who forgot his own name and fled from his family as though they were assassins. The king, who, in one notorious episode, ran through forest in a frenzy, striking down 4 of his own knights before collapsing. For a child, such a father was a figure of confusion and dread. One day he might lift Isabella into his lap, his voice warm as he told her of knights and kingdoms. The next, she might see him staring through her as though she were a stranger, or worse, shrinking from her in fear. When the storms of his mind broke, the servants would spirit the royal children away, hiding them from the scenes that no young eyes should witness. Isabella's mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was formidable in her own right. Striking in beauty, shrewd in politics, she carried herself with the poise of someone who understood that appearances were a weapon in courtly warfare. While her husband drifted in and out of reason, Isabeau shouldered the task of keeping the kingdom intact, all while maneuvering through the dangerous web of French noble factions eager to exploit the king's weakness. She loved her daughter, but in the calculating way of medieval queens, always conscious that Isabella was more than just her child. She was a bargaining chip, a vessel for alliances, a future queen somewhere beyond France's borders. In the glittering but treacherous halls of the Louvre, every smile toward Isabella was measured, every kind word weighed for its political value. Outside the palace walls, France was still bleeding from a war that had begun long before Isabella's birth. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a conflict born from English claims to the French throne, but fed by far more than royal titles. It was about identity, about pride, about who would shape the destiny of Western Europe. Villages in northern France lay in blackened ruins from English chevauché lightning raids that burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and left nothing for the survivors. In England, the nobility groaned under the cost of endless campaigns, their coffers as weary as their soldiers. By the early 1390s, the war was a weary giant, staggering under its own weight. Both kingdoms, exhausted and bankrupt, had begun to whisper of peace. But peace was not ink and parchment alone. Peace needed a symbol, something human, something that could be paraded before both courts as proof of goodwill. And so the eyes of France turned toward Isabella. At 6 years old, she knew nothing of treaties or diplomacy. Her world was a swirl of tapestries, the scent of beeswax candles, the clatter of armor in the courtyard. But far from her nursery, the men who shaped Europe's fate were beginning to speak her name in council chambers, their voices low, but their intentions sharp. She would not know it for months, but the first threads of her destiny were already being drawn, threads that would pull her away from Paris, across the narrow sea, and into the heart of a foreign court where she would be both honored and hostage. The first whispers of Isabella's marriage came not to her ears, but to the echoing chambers of diplomacy. In 1395, the English and French courts began secret talks, not in public halls, but behind guarded doors, where only the most trusted envoys and scribes could enter. The idea, when it surfaced, was as audacious as it was delicate. Wed the youngest daughter of France to the King of England, and in doing so, seal a truce long enough to let an entire generation grow up without war. Richard II had reasons of his own to listen. Just the year before, he had lost his queen, Anne of Bohemia, to the plague. Their union had been a rare thing among royal marriages, a love match. Anne had been gentle, charitable, and adored by the people. Her death left Richard hollow, his court draped in mourning. His counselors, however, saw danger in his grief. Without an heir, the realm was unstable. Without a new marriage, the throne's future was uncertain. When the French ambassadors came with their proposal, they carried more than just polite condolences. They offered a dowry so immense, 800,000 francs, it could patch the wounds in England's war-drained treasury. More than that, they promised a truce lasting 28 years. To men who had watched the countryside ravaged again and again, such a span seemed almost miraculous. Yet there was an undeniable obstacle. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even in a world where girls were often married before their voices had fully lost the ring of childhood, this was young, perhaps too young. The French negotiators, though, leaned into this point. Her youth, they argued, was precisely the advantage. She carried no memory of the war's bitterness, no loyalties yet hardened by politics. She could be raised in England as one of their own, her heart as English as her French blood would allow. By the time she was old enough to share a royal bed, she would be the perfect bridge between two rival nations. The English court divided over the idea. Some lords saw nothing but wisdom in it. The dowry would fill the royal coffers, the truce would buy peace, and the young queen could be molded to England's needs. Others muttered that such a marriage would scandalize Europe. Still others feared the king was trading away English pride for French gold and empty promises. Richard himself, however, seemed struck by something softer. When the French presented a painted miniature of Isabella, the courtiers noted a change in his expression. Here was a child, they said later, who seemed to awaken a protective instinct in the king. Perhaps, some whispered, the childless monarch saw in her not just a political match, but a daughter in all but name. The negotiations stretched for months. Each clause in the treaty weighed and polished. Isabella would retain her French ladies in waiting. She could observe French customs. She would write freely to her family. Most importantly, the treaty stated explicitly that the marriage would remain unconsummated until she reached suitable years. In Paris, none of this touched Isabella's daily life. She still played with her dolls, took lessons in her bright schoolroom, and listened to bedtime tales from her nurses. Yet subtle changes crept in. She was taught English words in the afternoons, phrases to greet her future subjects. Seamstresses began work on a bridal trousseau fit for a queen, and the conversations between her elders grew quieter when she entered the room. Her fate was being inked into parchment and sealed with wax, her name scratched onto a treaty that would decide not only her life, but the peace or war of two kingdoms. She might have been too young to grasp the scale of it, but in the candlelit chambers of Europe's most powerful courts, Isabella of Valois had just become one of the most important pieces on the chessboard. The treaty demanded ceremony, and ceremony there would be two of them, in fact. The first was set for the English-held port of Calais, a sliver of French soil under English rule. It was a neutral stage, halfway between enemy and ally, where both nations could meet without stepping too deep into the other's territory. On the last day of October, 1396, Isabella, just 7 years old, was led into the great hall of Calais Castle. Her gown was a miracle of craftsmanship. Cloth of gold so heavy it shimmered like molten sunlight, embroidered with patterns so intricate that even the finest eyes had to lean close to follow their curves. Pearls as large as peas dotted the bodice, their creamy sheen catching every flicker of torchlight. The weight of the dress was such that she could not walk without help, and so her ladies guided her carefully toward the altar. Richard knelt before her to exchange rings, lowering himself to her eye level. The chroniclers say his tone was patient, his touch steady, as though he understood she was stepping into something vast and strange. She, for her part, looked neither frightened nor giddy, but solemn in the way children can be when they sense they are being asked to play a role. This first wedding was intimate, almost quiet compared to what would follow a union, sealed in the presence of high-ranking nobles and diplomats, the very men who had crafted the alliance in months of tense negotiation. But it was only half the show. The true pageantry awaited across the sea. 1 year later in London, Isabella was crowned Queen of England in the vaulted grandeur of Westminster Abbey. Londoners, eager to glimpse the child bride who had ended decades of bloodshed, poured into the streets in such numbers that, it was said, more than one life was lost in the crush. The coronation was a display of calculated magnificence. Isabella rode through the city in a litter draped with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, the symbols of both kingdoms intertwined as if the war had never been. Her train was carried by England's highest-ranking duchesses' women, chosen as much for their loyalty as for their noble blood. The child queen wore a crown made to fit her small head, its gold circlet set with gems that flashed like captured fire under the abbey's candlelight. Inside, the service was long and heavy with symbolism. Every gesture was designed to tell both England and France that this marriage was no passing truce, but a binding of destinies. Outside, the streets rang with cheers in a language Isabella was only beginning to understand. She waved and smiled as she had been taught, but the words were foreign music to her ears. The celebration did not end with the crowning. A feast lasting 3 days followed, with jugglers, musicians, and pageants portraying allegories of peace, triumphant over war. The tables groaned under roasted meats, sugared confections, and wines poured in rivers. At the high table, Isabella sat beside Richard, her manners flawless under the watchful eyes of both courts. Yet even amid the revelry, there were those who doubted how long this peace would hold. The 100 Years' War was older than Isabella herself, and in the shadows of Westminster's stone pillars, more than one courtier quietly wondered if a girl's small hand could truly hold two kingdoms together. For now, though, she was safe ensconced in her new apartments at Westminster Palace, surrounded by both French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons and the rituals of court life. She was learning to walk the tightrope between two nations, a balancing act she would come to know all too well. At Westminster Palace, Isabella's world unfolded in corridors of stone and tapestries, where the air carried the scents of beeswax polish and roasting meats from the kitchens. The palace was a labyrinth, and in those first months she moved through it like a small bird in a great forest, curious, watchful, and careful not to stray too far from the familiar faces of her attendants. Her household was a careful blend of French and English, a living reminder of the treaty that had brought her here. The French ladies in waiting whispered to her in her native tongue, telling her bedtime stories of Paris and the Seine. The English attendants, patient and deliberate, introduced her to the customs of her new realm, how to curtsy in the English fashion, the correct titles for each noble, the subtle difference between a respectful bow and a deferential one. Lessons began almost immediately. She was to speak English, or at least try, for an hour each morning, guided by tutors who corrected her gently when her accent twisted the words into something foreign. Afternoons were for the accomplishments expected of a queen: embroidery, the harp, and reading from illuminated manuscripts whose painted margins teemed with flowers, saints, and strange beasts. But it was the people around her, particularly the children of the nobility, who became her true teachers. The court was full of young wards and pages, sent by their families to be raised in proximity to the crown. Among them was Margaret Holland, a girl of 9 with quick eyes and quicker wit, the daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret became Isabella's closest friend and quiet guide to the invisible rules of court life. She explained who could be trusted with secrets and who could not, which ladies smiled in greeting yet sharpened their tongues in private, and which knights would bend low to speak kindly to a child, but turn icy when the king's back was turned. They played together in Isabella's small private garden, a square of green enclosed by stone walls where roses climbed in tangled profusion. As they sewed samplers under the sun, Margaret told her the stories that hummed beneath the polite chatter of the great hall, about old feuds between noble families, about lords who had once defied Richard, about whispers that some thought the king too fond of peace when England's armies still had strength to fight. Isabella listened and learned. Her mind was quick, her questions sharper than her age might suggest. One afternoon she asked Margaret why so many of the nobles watched one another as if waiting for something to happen. Margaret's answer was quiet, almost wary. Richard had been at odds with his nobles for much of his reign, she explained. There had been rebellion before, and there could be again. Some saw Isabella's marriage as a triumph, proof that Richard could win peace without a sword. Others saw it as weakness, a king bending to France when victory was still possible. The child queen absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of someone beginning to understand that her place in the world was not merely ceremonial. She noticed how conversations shifted when she approached, how certain lords would bow to her but not meet her gaze, how even her French ladies in waiting were careful in their speech. Still, for a time, these undercurrents did not touch her daily life. The years 1397 and 1398 passed quietly. She grew taller, her English became more fluent, and she moved through the palace with the confidence of someone who knew its rhythms. Richard visited often, bringing small gifts books from Oxford, a carved bird from Ireland, a jeweled clasp for her cloak. He seemed genuinely fond of her, and she in turn met him with a blend of formality and childlike warmth. But peace in a medieval court was always fragile. Even as Isabella's days filled with lessons, laughter, and the slow weaving of trust among her companions, the fault lines of Richard's reign continued to shift beneath her feet, imperceptible now, but waiting for the moment when they would crack wide open. By the first months of 1399, subtle unease had begun to settle over Westminster. Isabella could not have named it at first, only that the air in the great hall seemed tighter, that the laughter of the nobles rang less often, that her ladies exchanged glances they quickly smothered when she looked their way. It began with small absences. Certain lords, once constant at the king's side, vanished from court entirely. Messages arrived in odd hours, delivered by riders with mud-caked boots and guarded eyes. Richard's visits to Isabella's apartments became less frequent. When he did appear, his mind seemed elsewhere, his gaze lingering on the windows that faced the Thames as though expecting to see sails appear on the horizon. The truth, whispered in corridors and behind closed doors, was this. Henry Bolingbroke, the king's cousin and one-time ally, had returned from exile, not alone, but with an army at his back. Officially, he claimed to be reclaiming his inheritance, confiscated by Richard the year before, but everyone at court understood this was only the beginning. Bolingbroke's return set the kingdom's power brokers in motion. Nobles who had long simmered under Richard's rule began to drift toward Henry's cause. The same lords who had once toasted the peace with France now muttered that a king who bartered for truce rather than conquest had grown soft. Isabella felt the shift in ways a child might, through the thinning of familiar faces, the hushed tones in the council chamber, the sense that the world beyond the palace walls was moving faster than anyone could control. Even Margaret Holland, her constant friend, seemed distracted, her cheerful chatter fading into silences she could not explain. The break came without warning. One late summer evening, as the shadows grew long in her chambers, Margaret entered with an urgency that made Isabella's heart race. "You must pack," she said, her voice low and quick. "Only what you need. We are leaving tonight." "To where?" Isabella asked, confused. "The Tower," Margaret replied, her eyes flicking to the door as though afraid of eavesdroppers. "The king says it is for your safety." The words carried no comfort. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in times of upheaval, the difference between the two could vanish overnight. That night, the journey through London was nothing like the ceremonial processions Isabella had grown used to. The litter was curtained tight, surrounded by armed men whose armor clinked in the dark. Outside, the city's usual hum was replaced by something harder to name, a tension that thrummed through the streets like the first distant roll of thunder before a storm. When the tower's gates closed behind her, Isabella was shown to a set of apartments that were comfortable but unmistakably secure. Guards stood at every entrance. Her French ladies-in-waiting were allowed to remain, but most of her English attendants were dismissed without explanation. The child queen, who had spent 3 years being groomed for the role of England's bridge to peace, now found herself on an island of stone surrounded by water and uncertainty. The protection Richard had promised her was suddenly distant, replaced by the watchful silence of guards whose loyalties were shifting with the tides of power. The storm that had been gathering was about to break, and Isabella, still only 9 years old, was caught squarely in its path. 2 days after she was brought to the tower, Richard came to her chambers. The sight of him made Isabella's breath hitch, not because she feared him, but because he was almost unrecognizable. His fine robes were creased, his hair unkempt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The poised, deliberate king who had once knelt to meet her gaze in Calais was gone. In his place stood a man who seemed to carry the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. He took her small hands in his, sinking to one knee as if she were still the little bride he had promised to protect. "My dear child," he said, his voice rough, "our circumstances have changed. There are those who seek to undo the peace we have built with your father's realm and to take from me the crown I have worn since I was but a boy." Isabella had been in England long enough to recognize that this was no courtly exaggeration. "Are you still king?" she asked softly. Richard's mouth curved in something that was almost a smile, though bitter at the edges. "For now." He told her of Henry Bolingbroke's return, of the lords who had abandoned him, of the armies gathering in his cousin's name. For the first time, he spoke to her not as a child, but as someone who must understand the stakes. He did not hide the truth. If Henry triumphed, her place in England would be uncertain at best, dangerous at worst. "I may not be able to protect you as I once could," he admitted, his gaze steady but pained. "Henry may seek to send you back to France, to hold you here as a hostage, or to use you in ways we cannot yet see." The words settled into Isabella like cold water. She understood enough of politics now to realize that she was no longer just a bride in training. She was a pawn valuable, but only as long as she served someone's purpose. Weeks passed in uneasy silence. From her chamber windows, she could see the Thames glinting under the autumn sun, but no word came of battles won or lost. Her French ladies whispered among themselves, their voices tight with worry. Even Margaret's visits grew brief and strained, as if she feared her presence might be questioned. Then, one gray October morning, the sound of boots rang out in the corridor, heavier, more purposeful than the tower guard she knew. The doors opened, and in stepped men wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. Behind them came a tall figure, with a soldier's bearing and a politician's calculating eyes, Henry himself. Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied, the gesture drilled into her by years of instruction. Henry regarded her in silence for a moment, as though assessing the girl who had once been England's hope for peace. "Your Grace," he said at last, still granting her the title of queen, "I regret that our meeting must take place under such circumstances." "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, her voice steady. "Richard of Bordeaux," Henry replied, pointedly using the former king's birth name, "has abdicated in my favor." She understood the meaning well enough. Abdicated meant forced, but she did not challenge the word. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most. "What will become of me?" Henry's answer was measured. "That depends on many things, your father's wishes, the counsel I receive, and your own conduct in the months to come." In that moment, at just 9 years old, Isabella realized the shape of her new life. No longer a protected child bride, but a political captive in a kingdom whose crown had changed hands. Her survival would depend not on royal vows, but on her own ability to navigate the shifting sands of power. From the moment Henry IV claimed the throne, Isabella's life narrowed to the walls of the tower. She was no longer addressed with the deference due a reigning queen, yet her title was not stripped away. That, her French ladies told her, was her one shield. As long as she remained Richard's wife in name, she still carried weight that could be bargained, traded, or protected. Henry's council was split over her fate. Some urged that she be sent back to France at once. It would spare the expense of maintaining her household and signal that England was willing to renegotiate the peace treaty from a position of strength. Others argued for keeping her in England, reasoning that her presence was a form of leverage. As long as the daughter of Charles VI lived under English watch, France might hesitate to provoke open conflict. Through all of it, Isabella understood the peril of misstep. She moved carefully polite to Henry's messengers, never sulking in public, never uttering words that could be twisted into defiance. At the same time, she maintained the quiet dignity expected of a queen, however young. It was a balancing act no child should have had to master, but necessity had sharpened her instincts early. Her French attendants women, who had known her since Paris, were her lifeline. They spoke to her in whispers, coached her in how to answer questions without revealing too much, and reminded her daily, "You are still Queen of England in the eyes of the law and in your father's court. They cannot unmake that without your consent." It was a fragile reassurance, one that cracked when the first rumors of Richard's death reached the Tower. At first they came in hushed tones, that he had died at Pontefract Castle, perhaps of illness. Then came darker whispers that his death had been ordered, that he had been helped to die by those loyal to Henry. When confirmation finally reached Isabella, the news hit like a blow she had not braced for. She had never loved Richard as a wife. How could she, being still a child? But he had been kind to her, a protector in a foreign court, a figure she could trust in a world of shifting allegiances. His death was more than a loss. It was the cutting away of the last thread that tied her to the stability of her life in England. If Henry had sanctioned the death of an anointed king, what mercy could she expect if she became an inconvenience? Those fears became reality in early 1400, when Henry's council presented her with an ultimatum. She could return to France, but only if she acknowledged him as the rightful king of England and formally renounced any claim to the throne as Richard's widow. It was a diplomatic trap disguised as generosity. By agreeing, she would not only give up her position, but also dissolve the very treaty that had brought her to England. The war could resume without her presence as a tether. By refusing, she would risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. Her French advisors argued among themselves. Some urged her to accept safety, they said was worth the concession. Others insisted she hold fast, that abandoning her title would be a betrayal of both Richard's memory and the cause of peace he had forged. At 10 years old, Isabella was faced with a decision fit for a statesman: freedom at the cost of her crown, or captivity in the name of principle. And all the while, beyond the tower's stone walls, the currents of power shifted restlessly, waiting to sweep her wherever they chose. In the end, the decision was not truly hers to make. Word came from Paris, delivered through the careful channels of diplomacy, that her father, Charles VI, demanded her immediate return. Whether this was his own will, spoken in one of his rare lucid moments, or the maneuvering of his advisors during his illness, Isabella never knew. The message was clear enough. If England delayed, France would consider it an unfriendly act. Henry's government, faced with the prospect of renewed war, while his own grip on the throne was still fresh and precarious, relented. The terms of her departure were deliberately vague, crafted so that both sides could claim victory in the matter. England could say she had been released in goodwill. France could say she had been reclaimed by royal right. When the day came, the child queen left Westminster not in the grand processions that had welcomed her, but in a smaller, quieter convoy. It was summer 1401, and she was 11 years old. As the litter bore her through the London streets, she thought of the places she would not see again. The gardens where she had stitched beside Margaret Holland, the stone halls where she had learned to read English poetry, the window seat where she had once traced her finger along the curves of a map while dreaming of the world beyond. The Channel crossing was calm, though the wind carried the briny scent of the sea into her hair. She spoke little on the voyage. Her mind pulled between the country she was leaving and the one she was returning to. France was her birthplace, but after 5 years away, it felt as foreign as England had when she first arrived. Paris greeted her with banners and ceremony, yet even the familiar skyline of its spires felt altered. She spoke her mother tongue with a faint English lilt now, preferred certain English fashions, and found herself hesitating over the French etiquette she had once known without thought. Her father was deep in the grip of one of his darker spells when she was brought to him. He refused to recognize her at first, calling for guards to remove the stranger from his chambers. Weeks later, during a rare clearing of his mind, he seemed confused at her presence, as if the years of her absence had been swallowed by the haze of his illness. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was warmer in her welcome but no less calculating. She had spent the years of Isabella's absence waging her own battles for influence at the French court, and she knew immediately how her daughter's experience in England might be turned to advantage. A former queen of England, even a child one, was a prize in the endless chess game of European diplomacy. From the moment she returned, Isabella was asked questions about English politics, about Henry's allies, about the strength of his rule. She answered carefully, giving enough to satisfy curiosity, but holding back anything that might harm those she still thought of kindly. She was back in France, but she was no longer only her parents' daughter. She was an exile, a survivor of a foreign court, and a living reminder of a peace that had already begun to fray. And though her title of Queen of England now rang hollow, it clung to her like a shadow one that would shape her path in the years to come. Life in the French court after her return was a delicate balancing act. Isabella was greeted as a princess of France, but the years in England had marked her in ways that set her apart. Her speech carried the soft edges of an English accent. She instinctively dipped her head in the English style when greeting a nobleman. Even her sense of humor, quieter, more ironic than the flamboyant wit of Paris, was a reflection of the court she had left behind. Some embraced these changes, seeing them as proof of her unique position. She was a bridge between two realms. Others looked at her with narrowed eyes, muttering of English influence, as though 5 years across the Channel had somehow diluted her Frenchness. The 100 Years' War still simmered beneath every banquet toast and council meeting. Anti-English sentiment ran high among certain factions at court, especially among those who had lost lands or family to the long conflict. For them, Isabella's years in England were not a diplomatic triumph, but a reminder of humiliation, a French princess sent to sit at an English king's side. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was both shield and strategist. She ensured Isabella was treated with the respect due to the daughter of a reigning monarch, but she also understood her daughter's value as a diplomatic asset. And to Isabeau, Isabella's knowledge of English court life, its personalities, alliances, and weaknesses was as valuable as gold. But Isabella herself was cautious. When asked about Henry IV's hold on power or the mood among his nobles, she offered broad, measured replies. She spoke of English pride, of the people's devotion to stability, of the court's love for ceremony and tradition, but she did not reveal the quiet fractures she had glimpsed in the last months of Richard's reign. Her restraint was not only political, but moral. She had no desire to see England burned simply to strengthen France's position. She remembered the faces of her English attendants, the laughter she had shared with Margaret Holland in the palace gardens, the kindness of Richard in his better moments. Whatever Henry's legitimacy or lack of it, she could not wish suffering on those who had once been her world. This moral stance soon put her at odds with the more hawkish factions in Paris. In 1402, as England struggled with unrest in Wales and the north, some French lords argued that the time was ripe for invasion. They spoke openly of using Isabella as a rallying banner, the rightful queen who could inspire rebellion against Henry's usurpation. When her opinion was sought, she spoke with a clarity that surprised even her allies. War, she said, would cost more than it could gain. England would rally to defend itself, regardless of who sat on the throne. The people would suffer first, and whatever victories were won would be bought in blood. Her words earned her the distrust of some and the quiet respect of others. It was the beginning of a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life. Isabella of Valois, the princess who would not be used as a weapon not for England, not for France. Yet even as she resisted being drawn into war, she could feel her life being steered toward the next great move on the political chessboard. She would not remain a young widow forever, and in the corridors of the Louvre, her name was already being whispered alongside that of another powerful man. The whispers became open talk in 1403. Charles, Duke of Orléans. Isabella's cousin wished to marry her. He was 29, the same age Richard II had been at their wedding, but the similarity ended there. Charles was no grieving monarch burdened by politics he barely controlled. He was one of the most cultured and ambitious nobles in France, the son of the murdered Louis of Orléans, and a key figure in the kingdom's tangled web of alliances. The match was appealing to many at court. It would keep Isabella within the royal family, safeguarding her value for France and preventing her from being used as a pawn by foreign powers. For the Duke, marrying her meant gaining a wife of impeccable royal lineage, one who had lived in England and understood its politics intimately, a potential advantage if the simmering Anglo-French tensions ever boiled over again. For Isabella, the proposal was far more complex. She had met Charles before, in passing, when she was a child, and remembered him as courteous and attentive. But this was not the same as choosing a husband for love. Her first marriage had been arranged when she was too young to even comprehend it. Now, at nearly 14, she was old enough to recognize both the freedom and the constraints such a union could bring. Still, she could not ignore what set Charles apart. He spoke to her not as a girl to be instructed, but as someone whose opinions mattered. When they met privately to discuss the prospect of marriage, he told her plainly, "I am not seeking the widow of an English king. I am seeking Isabella I, who has endured the courts of 2 kingdoms and remained her own." It was a sentiment she had never heard from any man before, and it stirred something long dormant in her, the idea that she might be more than a pawn in someone else's game. The timing of the marriage was delicate. England was in turmoil. Henry IV faced rebellions in the north and unrest in Wales. Some in France wondered if Isabella might still be called upon to play a role in English politics, perhaps even as a legitimizing figure should Henry fall. That made her an even more valuable bride, and it gave the Duke of Orléans a reason to move quickly. By early 1406, the arrangements were complete. Isabella would marry Charles in Paris, and this time there would be no quiet diplomatic half-measures. The wedding would be a celebration of French strength and unity, a deliberate contrast to the somber, restrained ceremony that had bound her to Richard years before. When the day came, Isabella was 16. She walked the long aisle of Notre Dame in a gown of deep blue silk, embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, a crown of sapphires and pearls resting on her dark hair. This was no timid child in a dress too heavy for her to bear. This was a young woman who stepped forward with measured confidence, meeting the eyes of the man who would be her partner. The vows were spoken clearly, without hesitation. Observers noted how the bride and groom looked directly at each other, not simply at the priest, as if the words were meant for them alone. For the first time in her life, Isabella was entering a marriage with the possibility, if not the promise, of genuine choice. And in that moment, as the bells of Paris rang out over the rooftops, she felt something she had never felt before on her wedding day: hope. The wedding festivities that followed Isabella's marriage to Charles were unlike anything she had known in England. Where her first wedding had been a careful diplomatic formality, this was a declaration of alliance, of prestige, and of joy. Troubadours sang ballads in their honor. Actors staged allegories of love triumphant over hardship, and the tables overflowed with delicacies from every corner of the realm. Isabella entered the Orléans household not as a child bride under tutelage, but as a duchess expected to share in the governance and representation of her husband's domains. Charles, true to his word, treated her as a partner. They spoke often, not just of household matters, but of politics, literature, and the arts. He was an avid patron of poets and painters, and Isabella soon became one herself. In the refined halls of the Hôtel de Clisson in Paris, where the Orléans court often gathered, she found a rhythm of life that was both intellectually rich and emotionally steady. She began commissioning illuminated manuscripts, inviting scholars to discuss history and theology, and encouraging musicians whose work blended French lyricism with the structured harmonies she remembered from England. In the summer of 1407, Isabella gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Jeanne. Unlike many noblewomen of her station, she insisted on nursing her herself, defying the court physicians who urged her to entrust the infant to a wet nurse. She wanted to be present in her daughter's life in a way her own mother, for all her political skill, had rarely been in hers. Charles doted on Jeanne, but what struck Isabella most was his presence, not merely as a figurehead father, but as a man who spent real time with their child. She would find him in the nursery, a velvet-clad duke bending low to make the baby laugh, or holding Jeanne at the window to show her the rooftops of Paris glittering after rain. The bond between Isabella and Charles deepened in those first years. He valued her insights into England, though she offered them sparingly, always aware of how easily information could be twisted to serve ambitions she did not share. She valued his willingness to listen, to debate, and rare for a man of his position to concede when her argument proved stronger. Together they began shaping a small court at Blois, their favorite residence outside Paris. It became a haven for artists and thinkers, where the talk of war and faction could, for a time, be set aside. But France beyond their walls was restless. Its politics still snarled in the tensions that had plagued it since her father's decline. For Isabella, those years felt like a reprieve, a brief golden span in which she could imagine a life defined by partnership and creation rather than survival. Yet even as she embroidered Jeanne's christening gown and planned the next poetry contest at Blois, she knew the world outside their gates was shifting. And when the first tremor came, it would shatter that fragile peace forever. The blow fell in November 1407. Paris was already a city on edge. Factions within the French court had been circling each other for years, their rivalries sharpened by the king's frequent descents into madness. The two most powerful men in France after Charles VI himself were Louis of Orléans, Charles's father, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Their enmity was no longer confined to council debates. It had become a matter of whispered plots and thinly veiled threats. On a cold evening, Louis of Orléans was returning to his residence when armed men set upon him in the streets. The attack was swift and merciless, swords drawn, no warning, no chance to flee. The killer struck with practiced precision, leaving his body sprawled on the cobblestones, the torchlight glinting off the blood pooling beneath him. By dawn, word spread through Paris like wildfire. The Duke of Burgundy had ordered the assassination. The brazenness of it stunned even the most hardened courtiers, an open murder of the king's own brother carried out in the heart of the capital. For Isabella, the shock was twofold. She had known Louis not only as her husband's father, but as a man who had shown her kindness in her early days back in France. More than that, the murder tore open the political fault lines in a way that left her own family perilously exposed. Charles, as Louis's heir, now stood at the center of a feud that promised to ignite the entire kingdom. Grief mingled with fear. Security around Isabella tightened overnight. Guards shadowed her steps, and her movements were restricted to trusted spaces. Letters were scrutinized, visitors vetted, and the once lively gatherings at Blois grew tense. Every conversation shadowed by the question of what Burgundy would do next and how Charles would answer. The answer came quickly. Charles was transformed. The man who had once quoted poetry at supper and lingered in the nursery with Jean now spoke of vengeance in cold, deliberate tones. His days were spent in council with allies, gathering men and arms for the conflict to come. Isabella supported him, but privately she feared what the feud would unleash. She had seen England torn by political strife, had lived in a court where rebellion could strip a crown from a king overnight. She knew how quickly noble honor could turn into noble ruin. And now France was poised on the same precipice. The murder of Louis of Orléans was not the end of a rivalry, it was the beginning of a civil war. And Isabella, Duchess of Orléans, wife of the man sworn to avenge it, could no longer stand apart from the storm. The feud between Orléans and Burgundy did not remain confined to court intrigues. By the spring of 1408, it had spilled into the streets, the countryside, and the very language of France. Burgundian pamphlets painted the Orléans faction as greedy and corrupt, while Charles's supporters denounced John the Fearless as a murderer and a traitor. Armies began to form, not for foreign conquest, but for battle against fellow Frenchmen. Charles was constantly away riding to secure allies, inspecting fortifications, or attending tense councils where swords clinked at every movement. In his absence, Isabella found herself running not just their household, but managing estates, revenues, and the welfare of those who depended on Orléans protection. That spring, Isabella gave birth to the second child, a son named Charles after his father. The birth should have been a time of joy, and in private moments it was, watching Charles cradle the infant, she could almost forget the danger pressing against their walls, but the reality was clear. A male heir made their family an even more critical target for Burgundian hostility. The child was a living continuation of the Orléans claim, and that claim was now worth killing for. With her husband often away, Isabella became the central figure at Blois, a duchess who could charm visiting nobles at table and, in the same day, oversee the provisioning of garrisons. Her years in England had taught her the subtler arts of diplomacy, how to read a man's loyalties in his tone rather than his words, how to extract information without seeming to ask. She used those skills constantly, reinforcing alliances while keeping potential traitors close enough to watch. But she was not all politics. Isabella was determined that her children, even in these turbulent years, would grow up knowing a mother's presence. Jean was now a lively toddler, curious and quick-witted, while baby Charles had his father's dark hair and a grip that refused to let go of her finger. She told them stories at night, sometimes French folk tales, sometimes the gentler tales from England that still lingered in her memory. Beyond Blois, however, the war was merciless. Villages loyal to one faction were burned by the other. Fields were trampled by passing armies, leaving famine in their wake. Isabella pushed for relief where she could, diverting grain shipments, arranging safe passage for refugees, even negotiating with certain Burgundian captains to spare towns in exchange for ransom or political favor. These acts did not go unnoticed. Stories began to circulate of the Duchess of Orléans, who fed the hungry and sheltered the displaced, who could speak with a soldier and a scholar in the same breath. Her reputation as a compassionate leader spread far beyond her own territories, yet compassion had its costs. Every effort to aid those caught in the war risked drawing more attention from the Burgundian faction, for whom her growing influence was a threat. And with each passing month, Isabella knew that the fragile safety she maintained for her children might shatter with a single turn in the tide of war. In the winter of 1409, Isabella's life took a turn more perilous than any intrigue or political maneuver she had yet faced. She was expecting her third child, a daughter, though she would not know it until the day of birth, and from the start the pregnancy was harder than the two before. She tired easily, her color fading to a pale translucence that alarmed her ladies. Still, she carried on with her duties. The war had not paused, and Charles relied on her as much for governance as for the running of their household. But by late summer, her physicians urged her to withdraw from the public eye, warning that the strain could endanger both her life and the child's. When the labor began, it was long and grueling. Hours bled into a day, then into the next, and the midwives exchanged looks they tried to hide. At last, the child, a healthy girl named Marguerite, was born, but the triumph was short-lived. Isabella's strength collapsed. Fever gripped her, her breathing grew shallow, and the color drained from her lips until they were almost blue. Charles, summoned from a council meeting, arrived in time to see her pale form against the linen pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes flickering between wakefulness and a darkness that threatened to pull her under. For several days her life hung by a thread. Priests were called to administer last rites, and messengers rode to Paris and beyond, carrying the grim news. Somehow she clawed her way back. The fever broke, her breath steadied, and the faintest flush returned to her cheeks. But the recovery was slow, and it became clear that she would never fully regain her former vitality. The physicians warned her bluntly, another pregnancy could kill her. This warning changed her marriage in ways both tender and sorrowful. Isabella and Charles had shared not only mutual respect, but genuine physical affection. Now that closeness had to be measured against the looming specter of risk. They learned new ways to express intimacy, through quiet walks in the gardens, late-night conversations by the fire, the shared laughter of watching their children at play. But the shadow of what they had almost lost lingered between them. Isabella, ever pragmatic, threw herself more deeply into her role as Charles's political partner. If her body could no longer bear children safely, she would ensure the survival of the ones she had and the stability of the house they would inherit. But as she regained her strength, the world beyond their walls shifted again. Whispers reached her that the Duke of Burgundy was in secret talks with the English, a potential alliance that could drag both France and England back into the larger war she had once been used to end. For Isabella, still convalescing, the news was like a distant thunderclap, a warning that the storms of her earlier life were circling back. By 1410, the rumors solidified into grim certainty. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was negotiating with England. For Isabella, the news was more than alarming. It was a cruel echo of her past. She had been brought to England as a child to help end a war between the two kingdoms. Now, barely a decade later, the threads of that fragile peace were being rewoven into a noose that could strangle France. The Burgundian plan was simple in its treachery. Enlist Henry IV's support to weaken the Orléans faction, even if it meant inviting English soldiers back onto French soil. The thought of English banners marching again across the fields of France, this time at the sight of Frenchmen, filled Isabella with a cold dread. She had seen the devastation of such campaigns in both countries, but Isabella possessed something rare, a direct channel to the English court, born of her years as their queen. Though she was far removed from that life, her name still carried weight in London. Some remembered her as the polite, solemn child who had embodied hope for peace, others as the French princess who had been treated with dignity, even in the turmoil of Richard's fall. Quietly, through trusted intermediaries, she began sending messages across the Channel. Her appeals were careful, couched not in accusations, but in pragmatic reasoning. English intervention in France's internal disputes, she warned, would be costly, bloody, and likely fruitless. It could reignite the full fury of the 100 Years' War, draining England's treasury and uniting even warring French factions against the invader. Her position was delicate. She could not be seen openly working against Burgundy's alliance, nor could she allow her efforts to reach the wrong ears. The wrong word, the wrong interception, could mark her as a conspirator and place her children in danger. Charles, when she confided in him, was wary but supportive. He knew her judgment in these matters was shrewd, and that her insights into English politics were an asset few in France possessed. He also recognized the personal cost to her, the reopening of old wounds, the careful reliving of a life she had worked to leave behind. Whether her efforts alone swayed English decision-making is impossible to say, but in the months that followed, Henry IV's court showed less enthusiasm for Burgundy's overtures. Isabella had, at the very least, slowed the march toward catastrophe. It was a victory, but a quiet one. No trumpets, no public thanks, only the private satisfaction of knowing she had once again helped keep two kingdoms from each other's throats. Yet it came at a time when her own health was faltering, and she knew the battles ahead, political and personal, would demand more from her than she had left to give. The winter of 1411 settled over Blois with a damp, bone-deep chill, and Isabella felt it in every breath. The lingering damage from Marguerite's birth had never fully healed, and now it seemed to tighten around her like a net. Persistent coughs stole her sleep. Climbing the stairs left her faint and gasping. The physicians called it a wasting sickness, though they had no true name for it. Today we might call it tuberculosis. She refused to let her illness make her idle. If her body faltered, her mind did not. Isabella continued to oversee her children's education with a precision that astonished their tutors. Jean, now 4, was already learning her letters. Young Charles was given a nurse who spoke both French and Latin so that he would grow up fluent in the languages of court and diplomacy. Even little Marguerite, not yet walking, was surrounded by music and stories. Her role as Charles's political partner also deepened. While her husband traveled to secure alliances or lead troops, Isabella managed correspondence, reviewed petitions from their vassals, and even mediated disputes between neighboring lords. She kept a careful ledger of every agreement, every promise, and every debt, both the kind written in coin and the kind owed in loyalty. In the spring of 1409, there had been a fragile glimmer of hope. Preliminary negotiations between the Orléans and Burgundian factions. Isabella threw herself into them, leveraging her reputation for fairness. Delegates from both sides remarked on her calm presence, her ability to listen without visible judgment, and her rare skill of restating an opponent's argument so clearly that it could not be misunderstood. But the talks collapsed before summer, undone by mistrust and pride. Still, her role in them enhanced her standing at court. There were whispers that, had she been born a man, she might have steered France toward peace. By 1412, her illness was unmistakably worsening. She tired after even short audiences, and her ladies began carrying her letters to and from the council chamber. Some days she managed only to sit in the nursery. Her children gathered around her, listening as she read from a worn book of saints' lives or retold the legends of Charlemagne. It was in these quiet hours that she began the work she called her preparations. She met privately with Charles to discuss the children's guardianship, the security of their lands, and the alliances he must pursue to keep their family safe. She dictated a will that provided for not just her heirs, but also for her servants and the poor in the towns under her protection. There was no self-pity in these actions, only a clear-eyed acceptance. She had been born into a world where life was short and perilous. Her goal now was to leave behind something more lasting than her own breath, a framework in which her children could survive and, perhaps, thrive. Those close to her said she faced her decline as she had faced her marriages, her exile, and her years as a political captive with the composure of someone who understood that dignity, once surrendered, could never be reclaimed. By the summer of 1409, the wasting sickness had hollowed Isabella's once vibrant frame. Each breath came with effort, and her once quick step through the halls of Blois slowed to a measured glide, her ladies shadowing her like quiet sentinels. Yet she refused to be confined entirely to her chambers. On good days, she still appeared in the great hall, greeting visitors with a serene smile that concealed the sharp decline of her health. When the end came in early September, it was not sudden, but certain. She spent her final weeks surrounded by the rhythm of her household, the muffled clatter of servants, the scent of fresh rushes laid on the floors, the faint echo of her children's laughter in the corridors. Charles rarely left her side, and when he did, it was only to see to the matters she insisted must be settled before her passing. On the night of September 13, 1409, Isabella of Valois died at the age of 20. In 2 brief decades, she had been a queen of England, a political hostage, a Duchess of France, a patron of the arts, and a quiet architect of diplomacy in an age defined by blood and ambition. Her funeral was a spectacle of grief and grandeur. Nobles from across France and envoys from foreign courts joined the long procession to the Celestine convent in Paris, where she was laid to rest. The coffin, draped in cloth of gold and bearing both the fleur-de-lis and the Orléans coat of arms, was accompanied by the toll of great bells that seemed to hang in the air long after they fell silent. Charles was devastated. Those who knew him best said he never truly recovered from her loss, not simply because she had been his wife, but because she had been his counselor, his partner, and his most trusted voice in a treacherous world. Though he would marry again, he would later speak of Isabella as the one who understood him best. Her children, too young to grasp the full weight of her absence, would nonetheless grow into lives that bore her influence. Jeanne would make a marriage that strengthened the Orléans line. Young Charles would become both a celebrated poet and a figure in the politics of France. Marguerite's life would be quieter, but she too would carry forward the lessons of dignity and restraint their mother had lived by. In the years that followed, France's civil war deepened, and the peace Isabella had once been brought to England to secure remained as elusive as ever. Yet her legacy persisted in the alliances she had nurtured, in the cultural patronage she had fostered, and in the memory of those who had seen her navigate the perils of power without surrendering her humanity. Modern historians have struggled to categorize her life. Some see her as a victim of dynastic politics, moved and married like a piece on a chessboard. Others see her as a survivor who, even in the narrow confines allowed to her by her age and sex, found ways to shape her own fate. Perhaps both are true. What is certain is that Isabella of Valois lived and died in the eye of the storm, her life a testament to the fragile threads of peace and power in medieval Europe. She was not spared hardship, but neither was she diminished by it, and in an age when so many women were silenced, her voice, her choices, and her quiet defiance still echo across the centuries.